Admittedly, it is always a bit hard to tell when the president engages in an outburst, the degree to which he's simply an emotionally incontinent Fox News viewer who likes to talk back to the television versus how much he's attempting some kind of political strategy. But one tendency I think that has developed among Democrats, and not complete without reason to be clear, is a worry that engaging Trump on the fights he picks is, quote, playing on his turf. For that reason, it's really important to stress that the racist invective we see from him is not broadly popular with American voters. A recent Fox News poll found that registered voters massively disapprove of Trump's handling of race relations, with Trump 25 percentage points underwater. It's also important not to allow the vileness of his racism to go unchallenged. Last week, anti-racism educator and activist Tim Wise wrote about his time working to defeat David Duke when the former KKK Grand Wizard was running for senator and governor of Louisiana on the GOP ticket in the early 1990s. Wise wrote that mainstream Democratic consultants urged the anti-Duke PAC that he worked for not to focus primarily on Duke's racism, saying that doing so played into Duke's hands, allowed him to set the agenda. But the lesson that Tim drew was that focusing on the racism was the best way to beat Trump in 2020, the same way he helped beat Duke in 1991. Tim Wise joins me now, along with Adam Serwer, staff writer at The Atlantic, who's written about the particular, unique, and unprecedented danger to the very core of American democracy that's presented by the president's racist rhetoric in this moment. Tim, I wanted you, if you could sort of describe the sort of thinking strategically. Again, it's not a moral choice. I think everyone was very clear about who David Duke is, right? So the question is, how do you beat David Duke in the state of Louisiana? What kind of race do you run against him, and the sort of tactical decisions that were made when you were working on that race?
Well, the key is when you're running against somebody or when you're working against somebody whose entire politic is a politic of racial scapegoating and prejudice, to talk about things that are not directly connected to that racism and prejudice is to normalize it and treat him like a normal candidate. And unfortunately, in 1990, when Duke ran for the Senate, we did have these consultants and some conservatives within our own coalition that were uncomfortable calling out the modern racism. We could talk about the Klan, yes, the Nazi stuff, yes, but we weren't supposed to talk about how he was scapegoating black and brown folks for problems they didn't create, because that would somehow spur a backlash. And so the first election, we didn't push hard enough on that. We mixed up the messages with other things. In the governor's race in 91, we drilled down much more clearly, talked about this as a moral choice, talked about Dukeism as an existential threat to the state and the values that we held dear. And as a result, we're able to get the kind of coalition. The base voters for Democrats, absolutely, their turnout went through the roof, but so did reasonable Republicans, moderates, and independents. That's what's needed, because it isn't enough to just beat Trump, the man. Trumpism as an ideology has to be dealt a repudiation.
Adam, I feel like there's, you see these sort of savvy takes about like, oh, this is actually smart strategy, which I think is a little beside the point. But there is this question, right, about like, does this work or not? Is this effective to do what he wants it to do? And I'm curious what you think about that, because in some ways, what you write about is that the history of American politics is this often is quite effective.
Well, I mean, I'm not a political strategist. Historically, it's been effective, and it's been effective for a reason that Duke himself identified in that 90 campaign. So what Duke used to tell his voters, he used to say, remember, when they call me racist, they're really talking about you.
Yeah.
And that's important, because that's what Trump is banking on.
Yep.
Trump is inviting these accusations of racism because he believes that his voters will take it as an attack on them and then turn out in the numbers he needs to overwhelm his weaknesses. And I think that's a real danger. But I also want to point out that the one person who really closely watched that 90 Duke campaign was Donald Trump. And he said at the time, you can say what you want about David Duke, but the kind of things he's talking about appeal to a lot of Republicans. And if he ran for president, he'd get a lot of votes. And then, 30 years later, he's pretending he doesn't know who David Duke is.
Yeah, there was a remarkable moment where he was asked to sort of denounce Duke, and he, on camera, said, oh, who is this David Duke? I don't know this David.
He knows exactly who David Duke was because he's running his 90 campaign, and he's going to do it again in 2020, and he's going to count on the injured feelings of his voters.
That's a great point.
He's counting on them feeling under siege from criticisms from Democrats on Trump's record on race to power them to the polls. I mean, they already do. It's true. So I can't tell you whether this strategy is going to work. I can tell you that it's not magic. It's not genius. It is the oldest type of politics in American history.
It's literally the oldest kind of politics the country has. And there's a question, Tim. I mean, again, we don't know, right? We don't know what it does. But it also is the case that it does turn some people off, and not just people of color. Like it is a way of juicing turnout among some folks, but there are costs to it. And I feel like sometimes the strategic takes lose sight of that, which is something that your experience in the Duke campaign suggests is a real thing.
Right. I mean, here's the thing. Those of us who are progressive never tire of telling people that this is a center-left nation, mostly progressive. Well, let's put that to the test. I believe that. But what could be a more progressive value than pluralism and multiracial, multicultural democracy? I'm willing to bet everything on the idea there are more of us than there are them. So let's start acting like it, and let's demand a repudiation of Trumpism as a result.
And that's the question, I think, the sort of dilemma in some ways for the Democrats, right, Adam? And you saw it even in Sherilyn's, I thought, very thoughtful, like, of two minds, right? This idea of him controlling the conversation. So the president says something disgusting and racist, and I'm seeing like fact checks about like the city of Baltimore. It's like that's not the point. what he's saying.
Well, the issue here is really that, I mean, if you look at 2016 and 2018, a majority of the country rejected this stuff.
Correct.
Trump went hard on it in 2016, and most Americans voted for the other candidate. He went even harder on it in 2018, and he lost the House. The problem is that his coalition is ideally geographically distributed, which makes it difficult because Democrats have to appeal it's not so much that the people on the coast that they have to win, it's these people in the middle who might be more inclined to feel insulted depending on how Democrats approach the issue. That's what they're afraid of.
It's a really important point from the Electoral College standpoint. The coalition has this sort of added wind at its back because it's sort of mathematically overrepresented in the Electoral College.
But they are not a majority.
No. Tim, I want to just to give you like sort of two examples of ads that you helped us sort of find, which I think sort of show the difference in approaches at Duke, which I thought were sort of illuminating, clarifying when you think particularly about what 2020 will look like to the degree the president's going to keep ramping this up. Take a look.
Thank you and welcome back to Jabberwocky, the game show all America loves to watch.
Paul, I'll try tax cheats for $200.
He failed to file state income taxes from 1984 to 1987. Alan.
Who was David Duke?
In 1969, David Duke said, "I am a National Socialist. You can call me a Nazi if you wish." In 1976, he organized a meeting of a Nazi group which called for the release of all Nazi war criminals.
On the one hand, he didn't file tax returns for 3 years. On the other hand, he's literally a devotee of Hitler. Like you could see which one was maybe more powerful.
Let me say, even that first ad, there were references in the course of that 1 minute ad to his Nazism, but it was an example of how we had to compromise to sort of not tread too heavily on race. And I think it confused people. I think people looked at it and said, if he's a Nazi, why are we talking about taxes exactly? Yeah. And I think if your politic is one of division and racism, let's stay focused on that and let's call people to actually stand up for American values and what we know to be the better angels of our nature as a country.
All right, Tim Wise and Adam Serwer, thank you both for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.